And I've just come, having lived in Africa for the last 5 years, where there is a little bit of pushback, or a lot of pushback in some countries about this, where they say, don't tell us how to settle our situation here. Don't take that agency away from us. We need to work this out ourselves. And it is, for me, a second decolonialization movement that is going on, and it affects also the peace-building world. And this is not to say that we are not well-intentioned, that we are not really seeking for global world peace, but we have to, maybe this has to become a two-street dialogue, or even many-street dialogue.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. We will not learn to live together in peace by killing each other's children, said Jimmy Carter, who was a former president of the United States and also a Nobel Peace Laureate. We live in a world where wars erupt faster than peace agreements can be signed, where climate shocks and displacement test the limits of human endurance, and where the search for common ground often feels like a race against time. Borders are hardening, trust is eroding, and yet, in the midst of conflict, there are people who dare to listen, to hold space, and to guide divided communities towards fragile moments of peace. One of those people is my guest today, Dr. Antje Herrberg. Did I pronounce that correctly? No. Okay. She's an international peace mediator who has spent over 25 years in some of the world's most fragile places, from the Sahel to Ukraine, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. She has served with the United Nations, European Union, and leading peace organizations, helping shape global mediation efforts. But beyond the negotiation tables, she is equally passionate about the inner dimension of peace, resilience, presence, and awareness. Her upcoming book, in English it would be The Secret of Peace, or in German, Das Geheimnis des Friedens, explores how the way we transform ourselves shapes the future of peace in the world. So, Antje, if I pronounce it wrong somewhere, just please correct me. First, a warm welcome. Thank you for coming and joining us today. You have made peace your career. How did that choice happen?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for welcoming me in your wonderful podcast series. And I very much appreciate it already, listening to the many voices who have so many different things to say in different perspectives about peace and connecting each other. And thanks very much for the introduction as well. And the context you set to Jimmy Carter, and there's so many of us who actually do this type of work and who are rarely recognized, especially the ones that are working behind the scenes and on the ground. So I really appreciate that. And your question is about how one comes to the peacemaking world or the peace-building world. There's very many of us where it's not a very straight line. So it's not about getting up in the morning and saying, oh, today I'm going to be this, or today I'm going to be that. I think it is peace and making peace and being in peace. I think it's an essential core need that we all have. For me, it's something that's a basic need, and some of us are looking more actively at it and searching for it more actively at it because of the history that they've had, the upbringing, and maybe the spiritual sort of dimension as well. And that's why they begin to look at it. So there's no such job as becoming a peacemaker per se. Is that in a way is you become it because you seek it. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a special education, even though I do have one. I can tell you a little bit about that. But it is that you put it, you can be a peacemaker working in business, you can be a peacemaker working in a mechanics shop, and you can be a full-time peacemaker, maybe bringing all of these dimensions together, like technique, academic knowledge and research, a lot of field experience. So I have been academically sort of trained in many different dimensions because I was searching for that one answer. But I always knew somehow that it's not by just following one path that you understand and you become that peacemaker, but by maybe being trained more in an interdisciplinary way. So for me, it was economics, it was intercultural communication, it was psychology, it was international relations, it was mediation. All of them are interdisciplinary sciences themselves. And I think one of the most important part is having the experience. So I was in the late 80s fascinated by the way of people made such a strong effort despite all the walls that we have built to connect with one another between East and West Germany. And I became part of that movement. And that movement has been an inspiration for me for the rest of my life, because it just taught me that no matter how thick the walls are, there's always a way to still to connect one another. And this has been my motivation since.
Oh, that's interesting, because that's what I wanted to know. How did you finally arrive at that place? What influenced you to arrive at that place where you said, okay, this is where I'm going to proceed on this path from here? You said you were searching for that one answer. So what was that question to which you wanted that answer?
I think the question is really, how do we get to a place where people stop talking to one another and the dimension of the conflict spirals in such a way that you want to push each other into the abyss? And I think that was sort of the question, how does that happen? Why does that happen? And there's not only one answer to it. I think it's like conflict is like an onion. You need to, in order to understand it, you need to peel the many layers of that onion in order to get to understand that.
Okay, that's interesting. I think you were looking for the right question. You were looking at the right question, I would say. You've been in some of the world's most difficult places, they say, when people label places. What has work in those places taught you about human resilience?
I like that question because we use sometimes also in the West that word resilience in a way that maybe not people in those certain regions that you call the most difficult regions would use them. So resilience is the ability to really face difficulty, overcome conflict, and start over again. Yeah, that's what I've seen in some of the places that I've worked in. I mean, begin with maybe the Congo, where I was recently placed and I worked, and the ability for people after a raid or after an attack of a village to go on and continue to live a life is something that has almost shocked me. How is it possible that even though everything is taken and all material has gone away for what they have worked for, that people are able to go on. And I think it is then really part of the human nature, but also maybe always the belief in something bigger than themselves, the community that they are in, or that they think about a bigger, greater presence in that there must go on, life will continue. That is something that has really impressed me. That doesn't, but saying that, I don't want to minimize sort of the fact that there's a lot of suffering going on there, and resilience is sometimes just also a simple quality to be able to survive in very difficult circumstances, excuse me.
And after decades of working on outer peace, you're now also focusing on inner peace, or as some people would see it from outside, because I'm assuming the journey could have been vice versa. How do you see the two connected, or how would you explain that connection to the outside world, and how did that journey within happen?
So in the world of peace mediation, you see there's one part of the world it's very fast moving, it's going into crisis, it's finding quick solutions for problems, it's very stressful, it's very fast, there's a lot of ego involved in it because peacemakers like to be seen as bringing these solutions that make peace along. And all of that is basically also just chasing behind a goal or something like others do behind a deal. Yeah. So deal making is always at the moment, a word very much a currency at the moment. And I realized that is just only the surface really of what peace really is. And when you meet people, especially in very indigenous societies that are not overly westernized yet, or those people that have really instilled a peace with me, I always felt that there was something completely different. It wasn't about technical knowledge. It wasn't about academia. And so you begin to search for it. And for example, I saw men speaking very slowly or having a very still body posture, which then instill a sense of trust in conflict parties who want to then speak and say, this is somebody we trust. What was behind all of that? And then obviously sometimes you need to go through this type of shock also to be able to really be forced to go to the inner peace. And that was for me an illness and a physical illness. And where then I really saw that I need to strengthen my core. Yeah, I need to shine from inside to the outside rather than just be constantly focusing like a Duracell rabbit to the outside. Yeah. And unless you shine this through yourself, you will never be even able to listen to what everybody really says in order to be able to work to conflict transformation. And that came not that early in my life, but it came. And so it has something to do with all limbs of the yoga, yeah, with the sound and with the body and by stillness and through breathing. And that in turn has really nourished the work that I do. And I think that I can really safely say that I'm a much more authentic peacemaker, and people see that when I work with them on the ground.
That's lovely. That's a journey from the inside to the outside. And you used a word which I value very much, authentic. And you used another word which I also think is happening very often in the world in most of the industries, deal making. So whether it's peace or any other industry one thinks of, and I mentioned most of these topics have become industries. And when something becomes an industry, then there becomes a standard process and deal making, and that human other part of comes in to make money out of it. So everything suddenly becomes money juicer, and that takes away the authenticity unless, as you rightly put, the core of that person or a set of people or that team or the community stays grounded in the actual purpose and way of being. So as I see it, is peace itself is a way of being, a practice which evolves from the inside outside, which I see that you've been doing. I remember that I read somewhere that you also accompanied the late Marty Atihari to Oslo, the Nobel Peace Laureate, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Is that something? Was there some moment in that journey? Because I'm assuming it must have been somewhere momentous. Was there something that you would like to talk about which shaped your understanding?
So Martti Ahtisaari, who is the was a former Finnish president and a UN Assistant Secretary General, also became, or is actually one of these peacemakers that are, like, I think have become those really attractive peacemakers in a sense because of their presence. Yeah. So I've worked with Ahtisaari for 6 years, actively as his chief facilitation advisor. And there I saw that, he enacted this peacemaking, which is something that I could not learn in the books. Yeah. So I'm a very avid learner, but you could see it by, he's one of these people where I said he had the body stature, he had the breathing, he had the way of very slowly talking, like many Finns do, but he made these pauses between the sentences. And through the way he was doing that, he really instilled that trust and confidence in people. And he was never chasing behind that deal. Yeah, he only and always gave the opportunity for people to be together, to give them a space to talk, just like you do. And I think that was just so remarkable. He always tried to find a way, and he didn't have to be in the room. He didn't have to be the one doing all the talking. In a way, he was also a convener, a facilitator. And then he was just also, what was so amazing about him is that he was able to conclude agreements without being over technical. It not churning out a Sudan peace agreement that has 200 pages, but a peace agreement, for example, between Indonesia and the Aceh Free movement that was 5 pages. And by doing that, he really, for me, he stands out really as a mediator, just as Carter also stood out. So when he heard that he was receiving the Nobel Prize, he was also very, very modest in a way about it. And he didn't boast about it, but he invited not the very high-ranking foreign minister friends that he had, and he had lots of incredible connections, but the people he worked with. So he could invite 5 people, and he invited his 5 dearest colleagues. And during the dinner, when the Nobel Prize awardees get a dinner, a very fancy dinner, he asked us to stand up and, instead of taking all the credit to himself, he distributed the credit to his team. And I think that was incredibly impressive. I've never talked about it, but I think that was something that really showed that any good peace mediator is also a good team player.
That reminds me of something else. I think, in my experience and understanding, some of the most evolved human beings are actually the most humble ones. And I've also understood that the more you know, the less the wise know that the less they know, actually. The more you get to know. And that actually shines out when I see people, and the humility strikes me. It doesn't matter who you are in terms of a professional or what you're doing as a job. As a human being, the humility of people for me really stands out. It shows their presence. We're living in a moment where conflicts are multiplying across the globe. From your perspective, what makes today's global landscape particularly challenging for peace building? Or am I seeing it that way?
No, I think you're asking just the right question. And I also ask that question on a daily basis. I think there's several aspects. And one of them is that we have to start with ourselves. So the way of how we have learned how to do peace building, and it has become a very, very big and commercial field partly as well, is that we have a set of assumptions that sometimes we can engage and intervene and make peace, or enable others to do peace better than they can. Because we've had that training, or because we are specialists, or we work for that institution. And I think there is a bit of a resistance movement beginning. And I've just come, having lived in Africa for the last 5 years, where there is a little bit of pushback, or a lot of pushback in some countries about this, where they say, don't tell us how to settle our situation here. Don't take that agency away from us. We need to work this out ourselves. And it is, for me, a second decolonialization movement that is going on, and it affects also the peace-building world. And this is not to say that we are not well-intentioned, that we are not really seeking for global world peace, but we have to, maybe this has to become a two-street dialogue, or even many street dialogue. We are in a place where there's so many different ways of creating and working peace, and this pertains to the aspect of culture that I know that you're very closely attuned to as well. So that's the one part. The second part is we are also in a moment in our, let's say, global evolution where we have a huge shift of egos and powers and might, that there's a big competition ongoing, which is not unlike the one that we had during the Cold War. And that is coming very much from the top down, and it's no longer sort of only a civil society movement, but in between all of that, there is something that wasn't there before as much as there used to be, and that is the social media. And I think all of that creates this huge tectonic shifting of egos and powers, and that makes it very, very difficult at the moment to settle on peace. And I wish, in a way, that the political leaders, the heads of institutions, would let civil society and societies give them more of a role and of a voice in creating a dynamic towards peace. But I'm not sure whether everybody wants it, to be honest. It's a big answer to a big question. Huh?
Yes, it's literally a Pandora's box now that we have opened up.
Yes.
So since we've opened up that box, let's go, thrash it out. I'll begin with, do you see common threads? Because you've worked in different parts of the globe, and you've been a lot of years in different parts of Africa as well. You see connecting dots, common threads that connect these different conflicts between the East and the West and South? So two parts. Do you see between the conflicts themselves some commonalities? And B, different ways of handling the conflict in different parts of the world? That will be interesting because that calls for a different set of abilities and way of being. So again, it's going into a larger question, which I'll go forth. So broadly, let's start there.
Well, I start maybe with one that's what brings us all together. So, as you know, I do a lot of training on peace mediation or peace building. And that training is done as a way to have a dialogue on the topic that means different things to different people, peace. And one question that I usually ask in every workshop is, close your eyes and imagine what peace looks like to you. And so people close their eyes and they imagine, and then I ask them, so what is it? And I think pretty much 90% would say, maybe you've just imagined it yourself, would say one of the two is that they see beautiful nature and a peaceful landscape, and or they see their family. Yeah. And that brings all of us together. That's what that's for us very often, as simple as it is, peace, is that connectedness and peaceful nature. So the way of how to deal with this is so the question about, what similarity you have in terms of conflicts across the globe is that I think there's at the moment two very important things, and it's identity, is that different communities or places have an expression of their own identity and would like to be recognized. So that's very important. That's why I say maybe we are also in a new decolonialization movement, that borders are looking to be shifted in different ways. And obviously the authorities and the international community is opposing this because we have to, in a way, maintain order in some way. So peace is always like a tension as well, or conflict is between order and structure and chaos, which can also sometimes bring something very positive. I'm not always saying that conflict is something that's bad, but it can bring about positive change. And you know this as well. Then you see another aspect happening is that there's a lot of power grabbing in different countries that happens also fairly regularly across the globe. Lots of autocracies establishing themselves. And maybe it's because of the fact that different democracies don't work the way they were intentioned to be. So that requires a huge systemic change as well. Then if you ask about different ways of how conflicts are being dealt with in terms of resolution, there's very different ways. And you have, I think, partly your roots in India as well, or in Asia and in Africa. I've seen so many different nuances. And just to give you some examples that, for example, when I worked in Asia, it was much more about what was not said around the table than what was really put on the table. So you had to find a way to work with those aspects that you don't really openly discuss. You would never fight or shout at each other. Whereas in the West, or we in Europe, we like a lot of that very strong sort of sometimes colliding positions and talking about that and working it out in a very sort of active and energetic way. In Africa, I've seen it through a lot of, in the Sahel zone, for example, quiet talking, sitting together, resolving issues until they were resolved. So there's so many different ways of sorting it out in a way. But we need to be open to recognize those cultural vibrations.
So what I understand is from the side of peace making, I actually had a question there, but it pretty much answered. So different cultural perspectives shape the way dialogues unfold. So which also means that any mediator has to be interculturally competent, or I love that word, which is now, and I totally believe in that, the culture quotient, the cultural competence. So instead of EQ and IQ, also there is a CQ, the cultural intelligence. So that would play a vital part in dialogue shaping or peacemaking in different parts of the globe. Now we roll back. As that is peacemaking. Now, as far as that is peacemaking, coming back to conflict. If we go through the surface and the superficial layers, in your opinion, conflicts in different parts of the world root from the similar things or from different aspects? Come from similar aspects or different aspects?
Okay, so you're asking, so you're throwing an analytical eye on it, which is extremely important. And first of all, I just want to say most conflict specialists who try to explain conflict always say you need to understand it from the root. So that's why I like your question very much. And most peace mediators also, they work sort of in the diplomatic level, or sometimes look only at that surface. They look at if you imagine the conflict like a tree, because you looked at the roots, you asked about the roots. Most of them look only at the leaves or the branches of the conflict, but not maybe at what happens all the way down in the roots of that tree that made that conflict happen. So your question was about, in all of these conflict trees around the world, are the roots the same or are they different? And I must say to you that I don't really know, because I think every conflict is so different that I wouldn't dare to now make some general comment about, well, it's all about the basic needs. That used to be a classical answer. It's about Maslow's ladder of hierarchical needs. I don't know, because at different times in the conflict cycle, different things are more important. Sometimes it is food and basic needs that's most obviously important. Sometimes it is culture. Sometimes it is about not being recognized or being heard and seen and acknowledged so it can be so many different things. But what is also important is that within the roots, you see also how the roots are connecting to the other roots as well. Connecting the dots, or maybe also the roots are sometimes intertwined and connected as well. And we know, knowing biology, and there's this whole interdisciplinary understanding, is that it's all connected. Yeah, so it's difficult to say, is it the one or the other? But it's very important to really zoom in and dig deeper and understand that. And every conflict is very different, I would say.
So we cannot have a typical stereotype where we would say, generally, I'm going to the conflicts in this eastern region could be like this, or the south or the western, it could be like this. So we cannot stick to stereotypes right now. That's
Yeah. So that's what I say now, but I'm not in the majority, probably. The United Nations, until very recently, they have technical expertise on, okay, you have an expert on power sharing, you have an expert on economic resources, one expert on natural resource, but we know, right, that they're all intertwined with one another. So you need to see the whole picture. And yes, as you're right, I would say that there's no cookie cutter method here.
You've mediated in places like Niger, Ukraine, and in the Middle East. Can you share a moment where mediation made a tangible difference, even if it was fragile or temporary, and it lit you up?
Yes, of course. Yes. And so I think you're pointing to the right direction here as well, because you could have asked me also the question, so tell me, what's a success? Yeah. And a lot of people ask that question. And a success in peace mediation or in dialogue is very difficult to measure, right? So how do you measure that there's one person after 20 years of being in conflict with another starts to understand why they are like that after having spent maybe several hours listening to each other because there was a third person there and said, maybe help them to structure and have that conversation. Yeah. I think that you start to make the difference, or the path to peace is being built by helping, it's as simple as that, people to understand each other. It sounds so simple and yet it's so complicated. Yeah. And also that they're able to look openly into the future rather than dwelling on the things in the past, which obviously need to be settled. But once they're ready to openly discuss about the future and something, maybe have a concrete idea about maybe one small thing happening. Like in Georgia, we started to have school children visiting other regions that were occupied, for example. Georgian children coming to Abkhazia, Abkhazian children coming to Georgia just to see and visit and then come home and tell their parents how it was. They were not all monsters over there. They were actually kind of nice. Something like this. Or in Niger, where a concrete result would be that those young men who have radicalized after talking to women with whom I talk to, with whom we've been working together, have decided to come back to their families and maybe do something different. Or, I mean, there's so many examples, but what's important, is that it's not the big deals. It's about the small, I call them the micro moments of peace, where you start to build the path. And once you take that little turn towards that side, you can already see the next one. In technical terms, we call them at the UN confidence building measures. It sounds a bit empty, but it is really, these are important steps in the path.
That's interesting, because a field of energy and science and spirituality, since spirituality and science are so closely linked, there are no borders, they are one. In my language, they are both the same. It's called turning the wheel. So there is that point when the turn starts, and then it's just a matter of process. But is that particular moment which is the most significant one, when it's called the essence of change, where you can trigger a wheel of change, in a way, of a thought process. And very interesting, actually. What do people most often misunderstand about mediation, in your experience, especially when they are watching it from the outside?
So when you say, okay, this is mediation or peace mediation, there's different types of mediation. There's family mediation, then there's the one that is much more sort of international. But I think what they misunderstand is that there is one person, a man usually. They think that there's a man coming who's going to sit together and basically is going to act like a judge and say, okay, you get this, and now we have peace in a way. So it's that deal making aspect. They say, oh, you're a mediator. There's a problem, mediate it. But mediation is much more about really helping and supporting parties to understand, to listen better to each other, to see things that maybe they haven't seen yet. And that subtle kind of work, which is very difficult to describe, and therefore I think people might misunderstand it a lot. So they think that mediators are kind of the people who make the deals, and that deal making for real, true sort of hard mediators is not even important. We don't really even have to write it down, except if it is a commercial mediation or maybe family mediation where you need to send a paper to the court. But what's most important to us is that the parties are supported in a way that they come up with the solution together. And then I think it is something sustainable because they've made the deal, not you. Because you can just walk away with it, yeah?
That's interesting.
You don't own the mediator. Yeah, the mediator doesn't own the process. The mediator just gives it, that provides it for the parties, but the parties are the ones who call the shots, really.
So if you had to define mediation, how would you define it?
So mediation is first of all a process where one or several third parties assist the conflict parties to come to a solution that's really mutually accepted or accepted by all. That's
so in layperson's language, if one had to also put it in another way, it would be one is enabling a better understanding of the other to arrive at commonly acceptable solution. So it's literally breaking borders in themselves to be able to see the other's viewpoint as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Very well put.
Oh, thank you. I'm learning every day.
We all do.
And how do you bring the psychological aspects and presence into something as tense and political as peace negotiations at times?
So, Minno, I think we all kind of know that psychology plays a role intuitively as mediators. But for me, it started to be quite decisive when I started to understand how trauma works on a brain and the way of how you listen to different messages and why you react in different ways. We deal with in very sort of very, very difficult areas, as you have described it, or as one describes it. There's people who have lived repeated traumas, and I don't think that we can assume that these individuals can sit at a table and just rationally, make a deal, and sign a deal. No, because there's so much involved. There's so many injuries, mental injuries, that I think that all mediators need to be aware of how they speak, how they relate to the parties, the way sometimes you're positioned, but maybe to make it more concrete. So sort of the psychological aspects and knowing and understanding how, what the psychological makeup of a person is, maybe also guessing almost a little bit what the past of that person is, and not making assumptions that they're coming from the same world that you are, is an absolute must for any mediator. Being able to understand how your body posture can influence another conflict party, how the way you talk to your conflict party makes a difference, the way they think, how you interpret their language and you reframe or you're using your communication skills makes them feel. It is absolutely essential. And unfortunately, there's not many who have this gift in the very sort of higher political spheres. And they would be much helped and assisted with those who appreciate and understand it. at least to prepare the ground for them, so to say.
That makes sense. And because I remember somewhere you mentioned about generally people expect the men to come on at the table. That brings me to that fact. In your opinion, you've been watching the international scenario over that many years. What role do women play in peace mediation? And what shifts have you seen over the years in terms of inclusivity at the negotiation table in different parts of the globe? So it's a two-tier question. What role do they play now, and what the shifts have you seen over the years in two different parts? Your answer is going to be very interesting because I had some other inputs. I'm just wanting to compare the inputs.
And I'd be interested to hear your reaction as well. There's a UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on the role of women in peace processes. And there was an entire UN agency financed and funded in order to be able to include more women into peace processes at large in order to make peace more sustainable. And I've seen amazing women work in this field as well. And now comes the but. I don't see more women as chief negotiators in peace processes. And I think there's even now, it's actually backtracking. Yeah, I think we see less at the moment. And but on the other hand, there's more women asking to have a seat at the negotiation table. And there is many more younger women, thankfully, who don't take no as an answer anymore, and are also able to organize alternative peace negotiations or use social media to demand it because they are entitled to a seat at the table. So something that maybe in my generation we didn't dare asking the same way. The next generation, I think I'm much more hopeful that we are going to have more women mediators and more women negotiators, because they're not taking no for an answer. They know that their place is at the table.
That's interesting. And another related question. In your experience, so I say in your experience because it could be different for other people based on the experience, women negotiators and mediators, do they fare better or lesser than men, or is it an invalid question?
No, I don't think it's an invalid question at all. I mean, okay, you train maybe even the same way, we're all different, but I do think, and I have worked also with great women mediators. I mean, I take Helga Schmidt, for example, a German diplomat who worked as the Secretary General of the OSCE as well, and she was able to close a deal in the Iran negotiations. Nobody else did this before, with Federica Mogherini as well, who was the HRVP of the European Union, the vice president. And it is just as examples, and there's many more than this, is the way of how they talked. And basically, there were a lot of women in that Iran negotiation, for example. It's the way, how intuitively maybe they would pick up a phone more easily to talk to somebody. I think it has like a different quality in the way we talk, and also in the way of how men and women relate to us who are at the table. So this doesn't mean that men are useless mediators. I think in a very ideal case, we would have a man and a woman at the head of a negotiation table. Huh? But I do think that we hear things differently, we communicate sometimes differently, and I think there is an intuitive, really sense of caring as well, and maybe that produces different types of agreements in the end.
Interesting. Because
what do you say?
No, it's interesting, and I can relate to that, and I understand that. I think we have lesser barriers in terms of ways of being on one hand, unless those barriers have been imposed by society while growing up, for example, or by the external world. And I did have one of my guests, in fact, also say that traditionally in many parts of the world, the women actually, unlike what happened in the West, women were actually the chief negotiators, whether it was in the families in different parts, he said, in some different parts of the world. And he also similarly mentioned about the innate skills, the inborn skills as well. So I just wanted a reference because you've been in the field in different parts of the world. So you did give me a similar one.
Manu, maybe if I can just give you an example, because recently I talked to a woman, real peacemaker in the Sahel region, in the Lake Chad area, and I asked her that same question you just asked me. And afterwards I asked another mediator man the same question. And both of them said the following to me is that, of course, the women are the most important in this negotiation. But that doesn't mean that they have to be at the table. So what happens is that we talk, the men, and then we do not make a decision, but we mostly go home and then discuss it with the women. And they have a discussion. And then it is only the next day with that advice and with their decision that we're able to come to a conclusion. So that's the other part. It's maybe not only that you have to be physically always present and being seen to negotiate. Some women have also a very important different types of influence that we don't see.
That's an interesting aspect, and I understand that. I get that. I get that totally. Because and I totally agree with you that being analytical and giving equality and justice, as my son would agree, I'm sure, it is important to have both influencing, in keeping in line with what you just said, influencing the finality of a decision. Because, of course, they are two different human beings, and B, different biologies and different ways of looking in order to make a decision more wholesome. I totally agree. In fact, I always use the analogy of a picture. A picture viewed at, if you have a picture right in front of you, you will see something broadly there. You may not be able to see a way a light is reflecting from the side. A person seeing from the side will have something else to say for the same picture, and from the right side and the left side. So in order to understand a picture in entirety, it is very important to have these different viewpoints, to have somewhat of a whole picture. I also believe that we will never understand the complete story of a human being in front of us. It's going to be a never, because all we will know is what the person consciously decides to reveal, or our ability to understand also the subconscious part. What we will never know is their stories which might have happened before they arrived there. So they themselves don't know that story in this lifetime.
Yes, of course. Yes. And this is also one of the reasons I always talk about the micro moments in peace. You're speaking about energy, is that this is why silence is sometimes just as important as the talking. So being able to steer people into, or conflict parties into, a direction where silence can be permitted, where they can feel what they have said or listen in silence to what somebody else has said, and everything becomes a different quality then. And this is when you start to, when all of these maybe also subconscious aspects there shine through. It's very difficult to describe.
I understand. And in your opinion, what is the connection? Now we come from the inside a little to the outside between climate change, conflict, diversity, inclusion, belonging. What is the connection that you have observed?
Yeah, so just like you, I think that at the moment, again, but I am not too negative about this. We still have this silo saying there's climate change, there's inclusion, there's diversity, then there's peace. In a way, thematically, they're quite distinct. And I do think on one hand, we need to have these expertise, the depth, in some of these aspects, because in order to understand and to work with climate change, it's not maybe only sufficient to know that climate change has very radical impact on the aspect of conflict and peace, and I can come to that later. But it is actually useful to have with me a scientist who really understands all of it for me and to translate it. And this is where it becomes interesting for me or for somebody else to what that means for global stability and peace. And I think that's what's missing. The integrated way that we're all looking for and is not really there yet. And I think that for that, we need to have much more interdisciplinary peace education. We need to be much more open about teaching our youngsters how to think in an interconnected way. And I think the future with all that comes with artificial intelligence that is probably getting better at thinking in this interconnected way than we are. But we human beings are able to plug these things together in order to bring all of these things together at not necessarily at the peace negotiation table, because there it is much about relations, but being able to create an understanding that this conflict is happening in an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem of the environment on the one hand, but also the people who are part of this environment. And if you don't value the diversity of the people or the diversity of the environment, the peace agreement will never become sustainable, but it will become a continued power play. Climate change is a conflict trigger and a conflict exacerbator, because there's more and more competition for resources, for water, for good earth, and it will become probably one of these key expert subjects, or it is for peace negotiators. But we need to understand that it's all part of a bigger ecosystem and think of them together. It's a long-winded answer to a very precise question, but it's not that easy.
Of course. Now, that is one word. We'll have a whole body of knowledge we have behind it. Sure, no. You've, of course, been working in that, so I'll come to that. Das Geheimnis des Friedens is a book you're working on. The Secret of Peace in English. Without giving too much away, which I'm assuming you would not want to, what do you believe that secret is?
Yes. Well, so it is exactly what you're suggesting as well, is that it's not only that outer dimension of peace. We cannot say, okay, peace has many answers, and it has an inside and an outside dimension. Yeah. And the secret is simply as that it's manifest and non-manifest. And we need to be open to all of this. And so it looks at both of the technical parts of how you can engineer it on the outer side, but it also looks at these aspects that are maybe more in the unknown. The psychological, the cultural aspects, the spiritual aspects of it, your own story that you need to know when you engage. So that's, for me, the Geheimnis des Friedens, or the Secret of Peace, which is probably part of your journey as well.
It's wonderful. When do you think the book is supposed to be coming out.
Yeah, one cannot be a perfectionist in it because then you never stop writing it, right?
Oh, yes, you can tell me that.
So I hope to have it published in the year, but let's see.
Wonderful. And if you were to give advice to young mediators or activists or even ordinary citizens who want to contribute to peace, and where would they begin?
So I tell very often to people who ask me that question, so where do I start? And I said, start at the copy machine. Start the way of how you talk to your colleague today at the copy machine is the first step. Yeah, the way of how you talk to the person who's handing you over a coffee and how you react to them, that's the first step. So that's the second step. Then, if you want to make this a profession, is that don't be over obsessed with studying the right thing, international relations or mediation, that you can do this. You can become a peacemaker in any field you're working in. And I think that's really important. You cannot just leave it to those people who, who think that they have academically studied it. It is everybody can do it. So really, don't overthink it. Just do it. You can make a difference in any community you live, I think. But you need to have that motivation as well. Sorry.
If just occurred to me, if you had to think of one moment or one time in your entire journey of peacemaking and arriving at peacemaking across different regions and countries, sets of people, one moment or another one where you felt, oh, this is why I do what I do. Would you like to share one of them? I'm assuming there might be more. So would you like to share one of those precious?
So I can tell you, maybe I tell you two of them because there's one inner and outer.
Oh, lovely. That's more the joy.
Yeah. So I think the one very important conscious moment, and I call them conscious moments that I had, is that was in your country, and then I was in an ashram, and it was the time, just auspicious time, just before the sun is getting up. Yeah. And it is that time when it's people call it the holy or sacred time, but it is that moment where there's some sort of stillness and it is without thinking about it. And it's that moment of complete quietness when you feel that you're truly here without having to think about something else. When you hear the noises around you and it becomes part of you and you're part of that environment. And I would always say that, and now I'm just leading from that, these type of moments that we are experiencing, and even if it's just 1 second, cherish them and keep them to yourself. And when there is things that are not so good, bring them back to yourself. So that's what I learned how to do. So that's the one part. And maybe more about the outer sort of practical peacemaking part is that when maybe one conflict party in an Asian conflict that I don't want in Indonesia was leaving the room, and he was then coming to me later on, and I said to me that it's the first time that he was able to say something and people listen to him. It's also something so simple. And I think then you feel like almost like helping the birth of peace in a way, just because you used the language correctly. So that's how it felt, that you became like a midwife. And that moment I preserved, and try to integrate it further into my learning. And sometimes I say that even you need to become like a midwife here when I talk to other mediators.
That's a nice way of actually looking at it. In fact, something similar to that, I was speaking to another global peace mediator, and he mentioned something very, very vital and something very close to what you just said. He said at the base of it all, it's the sense of belonging, the dignity that people need to feel in a room. So when they are seen, heard, and acknowledged, they feel that they belong and they have a sense of dignity and that respect, which is everything, which actually brings peace. And I think, if I remember, that was Saji who mentioned, Saji Prelis. And I remember at that time I was talking to him about the peace concept. Then I thought about it and I thought about it. And I remember because we spoke about communities and so on. And I realized that aspect is not just about countries and states and communities. So it's even with 2 people or 3 people, whether it's in the family, whether it's at work or a community, it all builds up. Everywhere, if you are not seen, heard, or acknowledged, you could just be a mosquito on the wall. So you're not really the human presence. And that gives a certain feeling of belonging, which leads to peace. Pretty similar to what you said, somebody felt heard and must have changed that person, I guess.
Yes, and this kind of things transform them because it is also a basic neurological need for people to need to feel recognized and also to give them a sense of autonomy. And once they feel that they are in charge and you recognize their presence and being, it's almost half of the ticket of getting negotiable behavior, as we call it.
It's wonderful because it's something is where one would say where you bring diversity and inclusion together. Multiple voices would be the diversity, and inclusion would be allowing them to speak and participate and ensuring that sense of belonging happens. I say that because a lot of times right now in multiple organizations across the globe, it has become a cosmetic exercise, a diversity, brown faces, white faces, and other colors being present. Okay, we need to have diversity. Let's get a woman there. Please ensure that she's taken there. One of the women who apply, or we need another brown face. We need to ensure tuck, tuck, tuck. But there's still no inclusion. And those are the very people at the same time, they will just be there without being really included. And then comes all the noise which is now happening. And you mentioned something which was interesting when I asked you about the women, and you said the younger lot are not taking no for an answer. And that's when I realized, oh, that is what the noise is all about, gender. Because some years ago, I had not even thought of it. I got lucky. I did not even think of it because I did not feel it. I treated myself as a professional. I did not think of myself as a woman. Man, woman did not occur to me. And I got lucky because it did not occur to other people as well, or at least that's a feeling or message I got. And I never thought of it. And since the last few years, I've been hearing this noise, and a lot of it is in Europe. Gender equality, there are less people and less people, women and so on. And I realize it's because people want to make that presence felt. And they really want it.
Yes. And they don't feel it authentic the way they're being included. They don't, so the way you feel is great, but I don't think it's because you have been a very successful woman in your own right and you believe in what you do. And I think since our world has been built around very masculine norms as well, maybe women feel like they're not able to be their authentic self, and they want to be included the way they are, not according to the rules others maybe have set 20 years ago. So I think even this will change the whole nature of peacemaking.
True, I agree there. As we close, I'm reminded that peace is never built in one place or by one person or just by a set of people. It lives in the spaces between us, between the East and the West, between the inner and the outer, between conflict and reconciliation. In my conversation with you, Antje, shows us that peace is both a fragile agreement and a living practice, shaped by culture, resilience, and the courage to stay present. So thank you for sharing a bit of yourself in your journey with us today and your understandings. And do continue doing what you are doing and being who you are being.
Thank you, Minu, and thank you for sharing this space with me as well and doing this wonderful work.
Thank you.
Truly appreciate it.
I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.